Yeah. Thankfully, they understand that a lot of us are like game developers and we don't expect to do anything before 10 a.m. So a nice late morning start. So we're going to be talking about building VR communities, asymmetry, asynchrony, and abuse. I'm sure it was the alliteration that drew you all to this talk. Or maybe just the confusion about what the heck are you going to be talking about. My name is Rob. I'm currently the manager for Google Earth VR. It's with a company called Google. You might have heard of it. We do some search stuff and some crazy stuff on a team called Daydream. Previously, I worked with Daydream Labs. So if you've seen me speak at VRDC before, or at GDC, it was probably my work on Daydream Labs that I was up here talking about. So during my time there, I think we did about 120 different crazy little VR prototypes, 1 week at a time. I think that team is now up to about 160, 170 prototypes. And before Google, about 2.5 years ago, I spent 8 years running a small game studio called Lazy 8 Studios. We did a really cool game called Cogs that you might have heard of, a really cool game called Extrasolar that you probably haven't heard of, but you should play anyway because it's really cool, and I'm going to have to discontinue it soon because it's way too expensive to run. We're going to be talking today about basically design considerations for VR and AR applications. So let's dig into this. What am I talking about when I'm talking about design considerations? Let's take a trip into the future 10 years from now and look back at this era in VR development from that perspective and see what we see. We have this huge number of dimensions that we can develop in. So you can think about solo versus multiplayer experiences, entertainment experiences, educational experiences, functional experiences like tools, cooperative versus adversarial, consumer versus enterprise applications. In my mind, when I look at these categories, what I see is this huge multi-dimensional space of various experiences that can exist in VR and AR. And we have explored almost none of that area. Like, if you take the cross product of all of these different categories, our explorations are so small right now. So what do we do about this? We're going to look back in 10 years and we're going to be like, oh my God, how did no one even see like genre X coming? Like there are entire genres of games that we have not imagined yet. But specifically for this talk, I want to talk about 3 of these attributes that I think are not getting enough discussion right now. Asymmetric experiences, asynchronous experiences, and dealing with abuse, and abuse especially for embodied avatars and VR to VR experiences. So we're going to dig into all these in detail, but let me first of all roll back a little bit more to the familiar experiences that we all know and love. VR to VR experiences. You've got 2 players with compatible hardware, 6-off headsets, you've got head and hands. This is an amazing space in VR. This absolutely represents the future, unquestionably. And it's just a ton of fun. So I'm going to show just a few examples here. This one is from a tilt brush prototype that we put together, not officially launched yet, but we've shared this a little bit. Representing here the explosion, the volcanic explosion of possibilities in virtual reality. This is one of those little experiments that we did with Daydream Labs. So we've got a couple players in a space together, working on a shared interface, which was specifically what we were looking at here, how that would work, doing some educational stuff together. So they're solving some physics problems together. We've talked at Google I/O about YouTube. So we have a co-presence YouTube application on the way. It's a little bit different form of co-presence. So your friends appear on kind of a dock space in front of you and you can interact with them. We've got Rec Room. I think everybody here has probably spent a little bit of time in Rec Room. This is a great multiplayer experience. The other day I went into the Wave VR. This is kind of one of the newer co-presence applications. It's like this virtual rave, really beautiful experience, different every time you go into it. But in this particular case, when I went into the Wave VR, I was the only person there. And that's kind of expected. The way that the Wave deals with this kind of the slow emergence, the slow growth of VR and VR communities is that they schedule times that people come in together and rave together, which depending on what time zone you're on may work well or may not work very well. So it's a beautiful event. This is definitely the future of VR to VR. But at the same time, this need to schedule events indicates a limitation. How can we get around these limitations? Specifically, let's think about with VR to VR experiences, what's the probability that your close friend also has a VR headset that's compatible with yours? They've purchased the same application. They're online right now in the same application that you're in. It's basically 0. So when we talk about VR to VR experiences, we're going to fill out this chart over time. But when we talk about VR to VR experiences, we know that's the future. It's really cool. It's really engaging. You feel like you're there with your friends. But the audience right now is basically 0 friends and a few strangers. How are we going to fix this? So let me put out a kind of a bold statement out there that I want to toss around for the duration of this talk. The most inviting VR applications are going to be the ones that understand how to engage those who aren't in VR. So one more time, the most inviting VR apps are going to be the ones who understand how to engage those who aren't in VR. So why is this important? There just aren't that many people in VR. So let's get back to those criteria that I brought up previously: asymmetry, asynchrony, and abuse. And sort of express this as a series of lenses. So the first lens is, how can I engage a larger audience by making this experience asymmetric? And Daniel's going to get up here later and talk about this in a lot more detail. The second lens is, how can I build an audience by considering different modalities of engagement? And this is like, this one didn't fit into our alliterative title. It didn't start with an A, but this is closely coupled with that first design lens. So when we talk about asymmetry, we're going to talk a lot about modalities of engagement. The third one is, what's the benefit of allowing my users to engage with an experience asynchronously over time? And finally, how is your application going to handle abuse? Sai is going to get up here and talk extensively about abuse. So let's dig into a little bit more of the definitions of these words. So when I talk about asymmetric experiences, what I'm talking about is letting users on different devices interact with a shared experience. And this is very tightly coupled with this idea of modalities of engagement. So we've talked about VR to VR, but what about VR to desktop, the mirror window that we take for granted that Daniel's going to talk about? What about VR to TV, via your Chromecast, VR to phone, VR to AR? And we're going to also kind of toss out a fun experimental piece that Daniel's going to show on AR to AR experiences. Next we have asynchronous. So in this case, we're talking about allowing users to participate in a shared experience, even though they're not participating at the same time. Maybe the classic example of this is Farmville. Like, you can go in and see your other friends' farms and see how they're changing. You can see that they've recently adopted a purple cow, even if they're not on their farm right now. And finally, abuse. This is just going to be a big one. I think we're going to be talking about this a lot more as we go through VRDCs and GDCs and figure out how to deal with this issue. This fourth design lens, we just need to consider potential for abuse in the very earliest stages of design. Once again, Sai is going to get up and talk about that later. So next, I'm going to hand it off to Daniel, and he's going to talk about asymmetry, asynchrony, and modalities of engagement.
Thanks, Rob. Hi there, I'm Daniel. I'm a VR and AR designer and prototyper at Google. Today I'm going to be talking to you about two of the lenses Rob brought up earlier, specifically asymmetry and asynchrony. I'm going to be showing a bunch of different experiments and examples that we've done in these areas, and focus on a variety of different modalities of engagements, including VR to 2D, VR to AR, and AR to AR. First, I'd like to talk to you about a type of asymmetry that we often take for granted: the mirror window mode. The mirror window mode is a fantastic way of getting people who are in the room with someone in VR, but not in VR, engaged within the experience. Great tools like Unity and Unreal have made it super easy to implement. It's often a no-brainer. However, it's surprising how much you miss it when it's not implemented. A great example of this is when we launched Google Earth initially. We didn't have a mirror window mode in Oculus. When Google Earth came out, I was super excited. I invited my parents over to try it. My dad jumped into VR, and my mom sat on the couch. My dad loved it. He was exploring all these different cities, but my mom kind of sat there frustrated. She kept asking what's going on, and I couldn't really help her out. It was overall kind of a frustrating experience. A couple weeks later, the team updated to have a mirror window mode, and it was a completely different experience. My dad again jumped into VR, but now I was offering different places he could explore. My mom was pointing out things that he missed. Ultimately, we were kind of like backseat driving in VR. It was great. It was a lot of fun. On Daydream, we saw how valuable the second screen experience was. So over the summer, we announced that we're going to be adding casting support to the Daydream headset. This means that you can share the view of any of your Daydream experiences to any cast-enabled device in the house. This transforms a single-person VR experience to something that's fun for anyone on the couch or anyone in the room. So like I said, we love the mirror window mode, but we think we can take it a step further. Interactive asymmetry lets the users not in VR engage in the experience in a much more meaningful way. A couple examples of this could be super simple things. Giving the user the ability to move the camera around, look at the scene from different perspectives, or coming up with interesting interaction models between those in VR and those non-VR that lean on the advantages of both mediums. An example of this could be someone's in a cave in VR and the other person has a map and they have to work together and talk together, so it becomes a fun experience for everyone around. Owlchemy Labs, in their app Job Simulator, launched a spectator cam feature. As you can see here, it's the normal mirror window mode, initially first person, but simply by click to cycle cameras, you're able to switch views. Now, why is this important? Mirror window is great. However, when it's a first person view in VR, it's often a little confusing for people outside VR to understand what's happening. The camera moves around a lot, you kind of just get a sense of what the people are looking at in that moment in their hands. However, once you start allowing people to move the cameras around, get different perspectives, you get a sense of the avatars, you get a better sense of the environment and what's happening throughout the experience. More fun for the people outside, more able to understand. You can also do this through a Chromecast. So this is a custom Chromecast view. This was an app that the Daydream Labs team put together where you could see a lot of what makes this app fun is the expressions on the people's faces, the character design, and the interactions between them. Had this just been simply a mirror mode, then all you would see would be lots of great shots of the environment. And while the environment's beautiful, that's not kind of what makes this app special. So simply by writing a custom Chromecast protocol and putting in a third camera, you're able to achieve a much more exciting experience for those outside VR. Now, this expands beyond just TVs and your monitors. It also expands to devices that are in your pocket. This was an experiment that our Daydream Labs team did, where they were analyzing how to translate the great act of reading your kid a storybook to VR. So in this case, the child goes into VR and gets to witness all the exciting, amazing things of immersive storytelling. The parent, using the device that's just in their pocket, can not only see where that child is looking, but what they're focusing on, what they're excited about, what they're interacting, and can walk them through the story. It becomes a much more interactive experience and becomes more of a conversation than a single person isolating experience. Another great way of doing asymmetry is through live streaming. While the other examples were specifically for the people who were in that room, live streaming gives you the opportunity to share out through YouTube or Twitch to anyone who happens to be watching in real time and then save it for later for anyone who is not. Now, this is also another method that you can enhance by making more interactive. You can see here that the team at Fantastic Contraption did this awesome thing where not only are they streaming out live, but they're also bringing in the live Twitch comments. So again, it becomes this more interactive conversation between the people in VR and those outside of VR. So asymmetry lets us share experiences across devices. This is awesome. Asynchrony lets us share experiences across time. So why is this important? VR to VR, asymmetry, these are awesome experiences. However, the amount of simultaneous users is inherently limited at the moment, either by the people who are in the room or those who are there in real time online. By sharing out, you dramatically increase your potential audience, not only through the amount of users through time, but also through the amount of form factors that can access it. A great example of this is through YouTube. So you can see here, this is a video from Tiltbrush. Someone painted this incredibly beautiful painting of Wonder Woman. It's 3D, it's awesome. But not only is this just a video capture, it's actually a stereo 360 capture of the scene. So that means as a viewer online, I'm able to interact with the scene, look and focus on what I think is interesting and important. If I think the background's awesome, I can focus on that. If I like these characters or the explosions, whatever I want. And what's great about this is not only is it available on your web, but it's also available on a variety of different form factors. So if I just take my phone, open this video, I can navigate the scene by just moving my phone around. Or if I pop in a cardboard or a Daydream device, I can view it in beautiful stereo. Another avenue for sharing out is through mixed reality captures. This is super cool. So what this basically is, if you haven't seen it before, is it's superimposing a real video of the person who's using the VR experience within the VR experience itself. So why is this important? Well, there are a lot of people out there who have yet to try the awesomeness of VR. And when thinking about sharing out, this is a great way that we can make VR much more accessible for people who haven't experienced it, who don't understand what motion controllers are or what a headset are, and ultimately make it a much more human experience. Now, what about asynchrony within VR and AR experiences? How can we make more awesome asynchronous experience? Well, we love the idea that when you interact with the virtual world, just like in the real world, it leaves a lasting effect. Your presence matters in this world. In this demo above, you can see someone tending to their garden, making changes, choosing what veggies to plant. They're making an effect on the world. The next time someone goes into the app, they can see all the decisions the previous person made. It allows for a sense of community even when people aren't in the app at the same time. So that's sharing out. Now we got another one in here, VR to AR. With the launch of AR-enabled smartphones, soon to be on hundreds of millions of phones, soon many people will have a 6DoF enabled device in their pockets. This enables new types of interactivity that build off of some of the things I talked about with sharing out, but allow you to also utilize spatial information and touch interaction. This was an example we built. It's kind of dark, you can't see it, but it's of a social movie-making app. Basically, you can grab a bunch of objects and props from the scene, throw it onto the stage, and animate them with another person simply by picking them up, clicking record, and moving them around and animating them throughout the scene. We wanted an awesome way to share out. So we came up with this idea of putting a little camera in the scene. You can see a viewfinder on that camera. And one person can shrink down to the size of the stage and film the scene, creating an awesome video for YouTube, viewable in many different formats. We think it's super fun. People came up with really, really fun stories that we shared out internally. We thought this was fun, but we wanted to push ourselves to think about new ways to engage other form factors, particularly AR. We came up with this concept. How can we use the 6DoF AR phones that we have to interact with this kind of scene? In this case, you can see that we replaced that camera I showed in the last scene with the actual AR view. So what that means is it's no longer just a viewing experience. The person in AR is actually the person who creates the output, the thing that goes on YouTube. It engages them. It becomes less of I get the lesser experience because I'm not in VR and more of a working together companion experience. There's a lot of possibilities when building AR to VR interactions. We're really excited to see what you guys come up with. So finally, AR to AR. We're incredibly excited with how multiplayer can make AR experiences more awesome. We wanted to show a fun experiment that we did in this area. We call this AR boat race. Both people have their own boats in their hand from their phone. They're placed spatially within the scene, and all they have to do is blow on the phone and push the sails down the scene. You can see it's super simple, but it's really fun, and people who do it get really competitive. You can see right now Kevin's in the lead, but Samantha's catching up quickly, and Samantha gets across this finish line. So like I said, it's super simple, but just the easy way of making this multiplayer, using the space, and using novel input methods makes it a really, really fun interactive experience. So there's a lot of awesome right now in VR and AR. Incredible platforms, new tech, and new experiences. More and more every day. We think it's super important to be creative in thinking about how you can combine all these awesome emerging technologies to better create, interact, and make the content more consumable for those in VR and non-VR. We talked a lot about creating awesome social experiences, but creating these experiences also comes with a large responsibility, thinking about and mitigating abuse. To talk more about this, Sai.
Oh, people are tall. Hi, new friends. I'm Sai Wise. I work at Owlchemy Labs. I am their studio director, Owlmancer, and also science. You may have noticed that Job Simulator and Rick and Morty Virtual Reality, neither one are multi-presence VR experiences. So why the heck am I here? What is going on? I want that one. Yes, hello. So my background in academia and things, so my background's in sociology. I focus specifically on video game communities, digital tribes, internet fandoms. In addition to that, also computer-mediated communication, basically looking at emergent technologies and how people connect using awesome, wild, cool tech and form groups and, make communities. I'm also an 11-year industry vet, and the majority of that was actually massively multiplayer online role-playing games. I worked for NCSoft for a long time, worked on Ion, Lineage, City of Heroes, Guild Wars, all of these games. And a lot of what I did there was I actually managed the harassment department, sort of dealing with people who had been harassed, looking at different types of harassment and helping people out. I also happen to be both privately and publicly a woman on the internet. I have occasionally engaged in business or entertainment activities on the internet, given opinions, all of which add up to knowing about harassment. So before I get too far along, I want to preemptively apologize. It sucks that we have to talk about this. VR is such a cool medium and it's so optimistic, and we think about all the things, like VR alone makes you think about what's possible that was never possible before. And then we have to spend time talking about abuse and people who are going to be rude. So I want to thank you all for being here and being willing to think about this and talk about this. And also, now that I've said it, now you can't leave early. Did you see what I did there? So I want to start with some definitions, sort of a taxonomy of harassment. So this can sort of break down into several modes that people are going to be gross to each other. One is auditory, saying gross things. This is basically using voice chat or text, sending emails, just being rude, saying rude things to other people in a rude way is auditory. Gestural is using rudimentary gestures to convey gross concepts. In massively multiplayer games, this has been sort of like using emotes or using rough gestures that are available and stringing them together in a sort of way that conveys gross concepts. In VR, especially with 6DoF hands, you have a whole new range of gross gestural experiences, because we are very creative as human beings. Then we also have environmental. This is basically using the elements of the environment in gross ways. In traditional games, this could be the sort of thing, so like in traditional MMOs, it would be the sort of thing of dragging higher level monsters into a low level area to like wipe all of the newbies and just basically be giant jerks. In VR, especially with 6DoF head and hands and interactable environment, this can be the sort of things like, throwing things at people constantly, putting objects on people's heads, obscuring their ability to sort of interact with the world. And now, with VR, there's bodily. Bodily is using one's own body to be gross to another person's body. And this is sort of new to VR. Basically, because we have embodied avatars, you're able to sort of interact with each other, touch and interact and move around other people's bodies in heckin' gross ways. And between the sense of presence and the freedom of 6DoF movement, even if these existed in other sorts of environments, it becomes incredibly heightened and magnified in VR. So what's currently being talked about? Because I am not the first to talk about it. VR has actually identified this as a problem, and a lot of people engaging in, or who are creating social VR experiences are talking about VR, and they are trying to implement things. So most of what's being talked about right now really revolves around tools, specifically tools for the harassed. This, the block and ignore feature is one that is in most VR games now. This is Altspace, has the ability to basically block any character. This is useful for VR with limited or a broad range of interaction abilities. So Altspace is, you can use it in the Oculus Rift, or you can use it in the Vive, but you can also access it with a cardboard or Gear VR, and you can even get through it with a web browser. So having the same way to block somebody no matter what technology you're using is really useful for them, so that people don't have to figure out the new way to block somebody in a new situation. Rec Room is another one. They have a gestural movement, which is actually being talked about a lot. This is basically the ability to, oh, hello. Yeah. So this is basically when you actually use an actual gesture. This works incredibly well with 6DoF hand tracking, and it's commonly agreed upon that this gesture-based or other physical resource is really instant and gratifying. Not only does it act sort of as like it's just constantly in your back pocket, you don't have to like go through menu systems to try and figure out where the block is. It's just always there and available to you. And the other thing is that in a resource and in a VR experience that is very physical, having a physical response matches that sort of the desire to respond is to respond physically, and having that physical response feels a lot more useful. In addition to the fact that a lot of times when people are all getting up in your face, they can actually like clip through any UI that you might be using. So having a gesture that, again, you have access to instantly is really useful in this situation. I want to take a quick note here about ghosting versus invisibility. So once you block somebody, what does it do? In the past, Rec Room has done a lot of experiences and a lot of experiments. Rec Room used to use this ghosting ability, which is once you blocked, basically everyone turned into a ghost. If someone was harassing me, they turned into a ghost, I turned into a ghost, we're all ghosts to each other. And basically what that was supposed to do was sort of tone down the harassment. It was supposed to put like a mute on the experience. You couldn't hear them anymore, you couldn't see their face, or what their face was doing, they didn't have hands. And it worked really well in terms of like dimming the emotional response, right? And again, you had an effect on the world. I blocked someone, something happened. Unfortunately, everybody else could see both of these characters as non-ghosts. This is really important because harassment often isn't just to harass the individual. It isn't just to hurt the target. It is often very performative. Harassment is often done for the audience of everyone else to see how edgy they are in harassing these people. So even though they're both ghosts, the harasser could still see where the originally harassed person was and could still act on them in a way that everybody else could see. This is no longer what Rec Room does. Rec Room now does the invisibility method, where both parties become invisible to each other. But this was a really interesting experiment and allowed us to find these things out. Another thing that people are talking about is the personal space bubble. High Fidelity has one of these, which I love. It basically allows sort of a ring around people that if they try and cross that ring, they just sort of zoop out. They're like, are not allowed to come into your personal space. This is really great in terms of being able to protect people and set their own boundaries based on what sort of interaction they want. And it goes a long way in terms of sort of stopping the harassment before it begins, at least in terms of bodily harassment. They can't even get to you to hurt you. The last thing that's being talked about a lot is surveillance and specifically audio and video surveillance. It's talked about a lot, but it isn't solved. This is an incredibly hard problem to solve right now. Everybody sort of wants the ideal world where like all audio and all video is always record and there's just a buffer running at all times. So if somebody gets harassed, they can be like, I can prove it to you. It happened and it was recorded and I have now given you the thing. And that would be an ideal situation in order to take action on these individuals who are harassing others. Unfortunately, that's incredibly resource intensive. For every single interaction of every human being and in every lobby and every private lobby, it's a huge task and is unsolved. So what isn't being talked about? Messaging and sharing isn't actually being talked about a whole lot. This is getting the word out. There are ways that people are talking about their harassment tools and sharing code of conducts and expectations. Rec Room has a video series called How to Rec Room that shows a bunch of different tools that they have available. There are blogs that people can go and read. These all happen outside of the VR experience. Inside the VR experience, people are still working on ways that they can best communicate expected behavior and tools that people have access to, whether this is tutorials or notices. Reading in VR is kind of rough. I don't know if I would recommend that, but this is the problem. And the reason why this is so much a problem is that there are no best practices yet, which there's a larger discussion of can there be best practices in VR yet when we're still only been out for about a year, and should we have stopped experimenting yet? We do need to experiment and continue to do so. But the problem without having best practices on this yet is that players don't know where to look for these things. If there are best practices and everyone sort of agrees that this is how you find and access this information, then players know where to look for this. Until we have that, it's going to be a little bit rough. Persistent identity, permanence of consequences. There's still a lot of ability for people to like log out and switch avatars and switch names and come back in and harass people again. So even if somebody's been blocked by every single person in that game, they can just go out and create a new identity and come back in. It makes consequences really impermanent. There are ideas that you can actually pull on from other online experiences, say reputation systems, where you have this sort of persistent judgment from the community that basically says, I am a giant jerk. This won't keep people from harassing people entirely, but it will help some people decide not to harass people if there is that consequence that they have to carry their actions with them. It also allows the community to sort of identify somebody and be like, that guy's a heckin' troll. I want nothing to do with that human being, and sort of avoid that person to begin with. So that's something that needs to be talked about a little bit more. Another thing that's not being talked about much is lack of agency. VR is a medium of agency, and when an individual is harassed, especially bodily, when someone's all up in their face, you want to have a physical response, right? This is why the gesture works really well. But again, a lot of times you get the sense that you've lost agency over your own body. Someone has affected you bodily, and you weren't able to stop them, and you can't really affect them in the way that you want to affect them because they're intangible. So a lot of these tools that we're designing need to sort of have the concept of how do we also give agency back to these players and make them feel comfortable and safe and one with their avatar again. The last thing that I want to talk about that isn't being talked about is tools for the not immediately harassed. This is a really nuanced sort of thing that's come up recently. This is a quote from Cameron from Against Gravity. It's a really difficult problem. Full disclosure, this was me. I was harassed in VR in Rec Room, and I went through the whole gamut, I went through the taxonomy. I had the whole survey. And so as I'm sitting there trying to navigate through my menu system, because I didn't know about the gesture yet, as I was trying to go through the menu system to figure out I was having a rough time, the guy was clipping through my arm, so I couldn't get to my menu system. And what I did is something that a lot of people do. I looked up at my friends who had been spending the past couple of hours with me. And they're all looking at their watch. Now, I know, because they are my friends, that they were also looking for the block button to block somebody. But the optics of it actually read very much like someone trying to disengage from the experience. This is awkward. I don't want to be a part of this, so I'm just going to flip through my phone. So the idea of the optics of the people who want to help out is really important there in terms of giving support to the people who are being harassed. Additionally, there are some people who want to, maybe off to the side, watching this behavior, may find it gross and want nothing to do with it, but they don't want to necessarily announce to the world that they're blocking somebody. They may be afraid of being attacked themselves if they announce that they're blocking this person. So maybe they want to do something a little bit privately. Maybe they want to make a show of yes, I support this person. And there's some nuances there that hasn't really been discussed. So we can experiment right now. There's a lot to experiment with in terms of what we can make for VR that works in VR. You can basically break these down into preemptive and reactive sort of tool sets. So preemptive, these are making design decisions that encourage positive behavior or sort of stop the harassment before it begins. This can be allowing players to customize their own levels of interaction before they even get into the space. Rec Room has a little private lobby where people log in and the first thing they end up is in their dorm room, and they can choose their avatar, like shirts and hair, and customize what they want to look like, and this is fantastic. But could you also choose perhaps the level of interaction you want to have that day? Maybe you want to meet a whole bunch of cool new people and you want to go out and, if it's me, I'm going to talk about my cats, but you want to go out and meet new people and have conversations about VR and you're feeling really positive. You could just go out and set yourself to public and meet all sorts of new people. But if you're having a rough day and you just kind of want to hang out with your friends and just talk about your cats, or play disc golf or Cards Against Humanity or whatever it is you want to do, Could you actually set yourself to basically kind of being invisible so that you can like go out and only be visible to other people on your friends list? Could you make it so you don't see anyone besides people on your friends list? There are ways with VR that people can customize their own experience in VR, which I'd really like to see us play with. The other thing that you could do is basically remind people sort of what the expected behavior is. And there are things like code of conduct. You could do like cool posters on the wall or whatever to sort of remind people of expected behavior. But there are also design considerations that you can make. This is something that Daydream was working on. It's the dog demo. The dog's playing poker demo. If I were playing poker, I'd want to be a dog. So basically, the idea is that you have a multi-present VR experience where people are playing poker, and one person loses, and it's always me that loses, and they get heckin' mad, and so they stand up and they go over to like, I don't give peace my mind, and the entire world goes black and white, and it dims a little bit, and the person looks around, and the only thing that's highlighted is the chair that they were previously sitting in. Maybe they should go back and sit in that chair. That would be fun. And that's the sort of like design sort of consideration you can do to encourage people to like engage in good positive behaviors. Just sort of remind people what's expected. And for this sort of situation, which is fairly limited in terms of like, you know, you're seated and you're playing, that works really well. Reactive, designing tools that allow victimized players to protect each other. This is after the harassment has occurred. This is already sad times, but we want the tools to report and remove the threat instantly. We're already working on that with like the block and report buttons. We want consistent and clear punishment for offending players. I talked about reputation systems earlier. These sorts of aspects can sort of like sort of reinforce that culture of not being jerks in VR. But a main thing here is you have to make sure that punishments can't be viewed as rewards or they can't be viewed as fun. I've heard everything like, oh, what if we give them like a dunce cap? Like if somebody's bad, we'll put a dunce cap. Well, apparently, if video games have taught me anything, is that we are a hat-based economy, and we want 100% of the hats. So that's something that somebody might actually seek to go get. Another one that I love this one, I hate it, but I love it, is the idea of like, oh, someone's attacking you, right? So you just push them, and if you push them, they go flying back, and it's great because you feel super powerful, and you feel like you have your agency back, and it has the added effect of you know that person's headset's going to go flying, and they might get a little sick, and that could be cool. It just feels really good. But that's the sort of thing that harassing players would also use to harass people. So like these are the sorts of things you have to think about. Even when you're thinking of tools that, you know, could be used to help people, you have to think about how they're going to be used to not hurt people. Also humor. I love things that give me a chuckle, especially if it's like, oh yeah, that's like perfect. That feels justified. So this is an example that also was tested, people were prototyping this, and it was the idea that like if somebody like started like coming at the person, their hands would just fall off. Like if they tried to put their hands in the other person's face, their avatar's hands would just drop. And it was awesome and hilarious, and it felt right, like, yeah, we took your hands away. Unfortunately, everyone else thought it was funny too. And so people who might be harassing wanted their hands to fall off. They thought it was hilarious. And so it inadvertently could encourage people to harass to see this funny effect. So we didn't go with that one. So a note here, this is all a ton of work. These are really hard problems, and it's a ton of work. It's hard, it's gonna take a lot of time, a lot of human power, but the industry as a whole is harmed by putting out a half-supported social experience. Just like all VR, a lot of people are going into their first social experiences in VR, and a lot of times their first social experience is their first VR experience. And so there's a responsibility we have to make sure that the experiences that we're putting forth are as responsible as we possibly can to make sure everyone's enjoying it. Somebody can be turned off from all of VR by going into a bad social experience, a bad any experience. So it's really important that we sort of keep these things in mind and try and develop good practices as soon as we can. The other thing is that tools have to be considered during development. build your features and support structures into your design as you're building as early as you possibly can. If you're starting to put in tools after launch, like that, it's way too late. Needs to be considered as part of your design, because if you are designing a social experience, mitigating abuse is part of your experience. I also want to touch on the culture thing. We have the ability to reinforce culture and also social stigma, which is kind of cool. Culture isn't only enforced from the outside, it's encouraging the community to create and normalize behaviors amongst themselves. So a lot of what you can do in your game as you're making social experiences isn't just, a lot of times people think like, oh, the devs are mean and this is the nanny state and they just don't want us to, they're no fun and they don't want us to have fun and they're over-banning everybody and whatever. You can actually encourage your community through culture, like through the culture of your game, the culture of your community outreach, and sort of transpose that onto your community as well. And your community will pick that up and run with it. If players have a sense of ownership of their own space and feel like they have the responsibility of protecting their space, they will also do this work. They are happy to sort of make this space the safe space that they want if you develop a community that sort of promotes that. So what am I taking home from all of this? One, don't let abuse considerations be an afterthought. You want to design tools and empower your community from the very beginning. So the minute your game launches, there should also be a set of tools and abilities for players to be able to protect themselves and sort of promote a good, healthy, happy community culture. And second of all, you want to experiment. We're still really in the early days of VR, and there's so much that we can sort of play with. VR is best done when we're making things for VR that work in VR. So we can experiment a lot, and while we're still sort of in our early days, we have this opportunity to do so and really figure out what works best. We have some things that work, but we could find there could be a lot of other things out there that work better or interesting or have these additional side effects that are fantastic, but we only find that out through experimenting. So try various things, try unexpected things, silly things, stupid things. And I would actually encourage you to share with the developer community as well. We're actually constantly talking about it. There are a ton of resources. If you want to talk more about abuse and social VR, there's like Twitter, I highly recommend. There's constantly game devs talking about this on Twitter, but there are a bunch of Slack channels and groups where people are constantly sharing ideas and resources and research to sort of figure out this whole wacky, wild world that we're in right now. And that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Sai. So I'm just going to summarize really quickly. Some of you might be thinking, like, this talk is kind of all over the place, other than 3 major words that start with the letter A. Like, what ties this all together? What ties it all together is that we really feel like we looked around the design space that people are looking at right now. And from the perspective of, like, once again, I'm going to bring it up, we're looking back from 10 years in the future, what are we going to look at? Where did we not spend enough time? And we think that these areas that we're talking about today are sort of these design elements where we're not spending enough time, not leveraging it enough to build social communities in different ways that are typical. So just to sort of give you that, the take home, I'm going to once again list those 4 lenses that we really want you to think about and consider applying to your own projects and thinking about how these sort of design ideas fit into your personal space. So once again, how can I engage a larger audience by making my experiences asymmetric, using different devices? How can somebody on their smartphone that they have in their pocket interface with this with an experience that somebody else is seeing on a high-end VR headset, or a Daydream headset, or in a Gear VR? Closely coupled to that, how can I build an audience by considering different modalities of engagement? So again, VR to phone, VR to AR. Think about where that audience is and how we can pull those people in, which also includes, let's go to this one, asynchronous. What's the benefit of allowing my users to engage with an experience asynchronously? If we want to build viral channels for our VR experiences, being able to export those experiences to YouTube, a place where we have an audience of billions, that's going to be an important channel. And finally, how is your application going to handle abuse? We just can't let this be an afterthought. So many people are having their first experience in VR today. And if their experience is a negative one because of a culture of abuse or because it wasn't handled properly, they're not going to come back for a long time. We need to think about abuse from the very beginning and make sure that we're prototyping and thinking more broadly and working hard to answer these questions. And with that, we have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. Thank you.
It's early, nobody ever jumps up, so I'll get this started. So great talk, thanks everybody. I'm Aaron from Google, and my question or comment, I guess, is directed more towards Sai's area. So I've been fascinated and terrified by abuse, like all of us, a little bit for a long time. And I think the problem underlying all of it is the moment we take a conflict-driven approach where we build complex systems to keep people on one side of a wall, doing things that we approve of, not doing other things. We are actually building a very beautiful, complex video game for trolls. So the more energy, the more lines in GDDs, and the more lines of code we write to try and block a behavior proactively, beforehand, I kind of feel like that's the struggle we're in. So it almost feels like we need a completely new way to think about it, other than sort of the tools you were talking about, which are what we have and have developed to date. So I don't know that there's a question so much as, has there been any thinking in terms of completely new ways of thinking about it? For example, when you're welcoming someone into their very first VR experience, when we go out on the street, we know there are certain risks we take. We know there are police about, like we kind of know the rules of that world. I almost feel like there's an element, like you said, of getting the message out, hey, this might happen. I feel like we need sort of completely new modes of thought around it. Do you have any comments or pointers or anything we can use?
Yeah, am I on? Oh, hello. Yeah, it's heckin' rough. That's no joke. And it is. And again, you don't want to have to build for the harassers, right? You don't want to build for the lowest common denominator of people who are going to be rude to each other. I have seen some other experiments and things that people are doing. I know AltSpace, I believe High Fidelity does as well, has greeters, like people who will meet you for they have a great team of volunteers, and they sort of leverage the community to sort of and they give them that responsibility. So in terms of giving your community sort of agency and responsibility to sort of make that community and reinforce those norms themselves. They do this in the form of greeters who show up and be like, hello, welcome. Are you having problems? Let me try and help you figure out. And here are some cool things that you can do. And leveraging that has been really useful. Again, I'm really into actually preemptive sort of experiments in terms of allowing players to sort of customize the social experience that they would like to have before they even reach into it. Yes, people are talking about it, but we're still in a super experimental phase.
And I want to remind you also of the video that we had, the video that we showed previously of the YouTube experience. In that experience, the other people who are in that room with you are on the dock in front of you. And it leaves very limited room for abuse. So a lot of the categories of abuse that Sai brought up are simply impossible. Bodily and environmental abuse, they're impossible. And this was a design decision that came from considering abuse from day one. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we say you need to consider abuse from the beginning, design it into it. This is no one's going to arrive at that solution by first starting with full 6-off head and hands, traditional VR to VR experiences. You have to, that experience was born out of, criteria one, make create a situation where abuse is basically impossible. Mm-hmm. And there needs to be a lot more creativity around that space.
Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. I really appreciate it, and I feel that there's a lot to learn. So just following up on that train of thought of having consequences or not letting abuse occur, doesn't that restrict freedom as well? For example, right now I could go up to anyone and do weird gestures. I'm not restricted to do that. But right now in VR, so far, it seems like you're trying to restrict that. So instead, why not create identity-like punishments? I don't know if you've used Steam a lot, but there's a VAC ban, and a VAC ban is usually if you've used cheats or have been hacking in games, and everybody kind of knows, oh, this guy's a cheater. So is there like a global identity that's being worked on for VR games, shared across experiences, or because there's Facebook, Google, and Steam, and creates a weird issue of how to keep track of all of that?
Yeah, no, that does not currently exist. It would be incredibly interesting, so that like if I went into so I spend a lot of time in Rec Room. If I went to High Fidelity and I was being a big old jerk because that's not where I usually hang out, so there are minimal consequences, but then I went back to Rec Room and that reputation followed me, maybe I wouldn't go to other social experiences and be a big old jerk. But that hasn't been talked about right now. That's really hard. And you're talking about a lot of teams across and various companies working together on this one project. It'd be interesting. I would really like to see something like that experimented with, but.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was in the VR's alt room, I think, and it was funny but ridiculous when a guy came up to me and just started yelling in my face, just at the top of his mic. It was the most jarring experience. So
yeah.
It's way worse than, let's say, playing a video game online and then having people yell and chat.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, this is also for Sai. Sorry, guys.
You guys have opinions about abuse, though. Feel free to just have opinions.
Thanks for that talk. I hadn't thought about the way that I kind of synthesized it in my mind is that you mentioned you as a woman online are harassed in a variety of media, and now the closer virtual reality gets to real reality, the more we can have this like terrible perfect storm of the frequency of online harassment with the impact of in-person harassment, which is like a real bad problem. And so that got me thinking about like, why is, like, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would think that real world harassment might be less frequent, or like, it's obviously they're both huge problems, but like there might be less frequency because of like a social contract or the permanence of consequences of someone like knowing, you know, I mean, like there's cops, there's authorities, there's like, your identity is tied to your like physical presence, right? I'm wondering if anyone's kind of broken down sociologically like what that physical real world social contract is based on, and whether we can have like a super version of it in VR. Does that make any sense?
I spend a lot of time late at night thinking about this stuff because, of course, I'm going to think about stuff like that. It is different. It's sort of in the real world, we have the thought of actual consequences happening to an actual person. In any online environment, there's sort of like a divide between the actual person and how they're represented online. So consequences don't feel quite like they apply to people. Ultimately the idea would be how do we sort of reinforce that and bring sort of those structures that exist in the real world into VR. A lot of it's actually social. A lot of it actually is, you know, fear of getting caught. It's fear of peers not accepting this.
One of the things that we've seen in a lot of our VR to VR experiments with Daydream Labs is that because the avatars that we tend to use are very sparse, literally just a floating head and hands, we have a different physical relationship with that other avatar, the other person's avatar, and I have seen it over and over again. People completely innocuously go into their first VR to VR experience and they'll say, "Oh, what does it feel like when I stand inside your body?" And I mean, you might laugh, but this is super common for first-time VR users if you don't do something to create a negative experience around that. And it's completely innocent. It's just like, wow, I've never been able to have this experience before. What does it look like? Like, do you see my head clipping through? Where does it start to disappear?
Right, it doesn't
like
hurt.
These are just like engineers who are just like, what are the physical limitations? Is it going to push me backwards? Like they're just querying the physics of that space.
Right.
But if the person on the other side isn't ready for that, it's an incredibly invasive experience.
Yeah.
And so it is going to be more common unless we do something about it. People do have a different connection to their body than they do to their avatar.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andrew from Apple, and this is kind of a question, kind of a comment. I have children who I like to spend time with, my children obviously, who I like to spend time with in VR, and I like to introduce them into new VR experiences. But introducing someone into a VR experience is kind of like debugging a software problem over the phone. Like you really have to kind of there's no direct agency there to really help them through the experience. And I would love to introduce my kids to Rec Room, but I'm too worried about, just being able to say, all right, like, back off. There's like someone along with me that can help me through the experience. And what I'm getting at is, should there be a mechanism to be able to, both considering abuse and asynchronous experiences, to be able to guide someone, to be able to ride along with someone in VR, and in some ways to reach out directly and affect or improve their experiences? Is this something that you've considered?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Like, this is something that I would love to see experiments with. Especially, this kind of falls into a lot of my, and I didn't get to expand on it more, but about the idea of, for people who aren't immediately harassed, for example, one of these might be, if you're in with your kids and somebody starts harassing your kids and you're with them, like, how do you as a parent sort of take charge of that situation and protect your kids? These are some of the things that we need a whole lot of experimentation with. Asynchrony, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Daniel hinted at this. When we added the mirror window to Google Earth, everyone was sort of able to follow along. But has been a lot of discussion about, well, what if I can point to a place and draw your attention there? And for a rec room, you can imagine if you want to be that chaperone for your child, what if you have the block controls available for every avatar right from that mirror window? And those are exactly the types of asynchronous experiences. The asymmetric experiences that we would love to see more of. What if your child can be in a Daydream phone, but you can be following right alongside on your phone and have a mirror view of what they're seeing here, but then some controls to control their experience on the other side of your screen.
Yeah.
Right.
These are fantastic. Oh, so go.
Yeah, I think a similar example is the storybook example that we showed, where again, it's directly bringing your kid into a VR experience, which the book we chose is a slightly frightening book for children. And the idea being that you can see where the kid is looking, you can see what they're focused on. So if they do get scared, it's pretty easy to talk with them, to pull them out, to take them back, to navigate them through the space.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great ideas, and that's the sort of stuff I'd love to see people experiment with and try and see what works.
Reminding everyone, of course, that VR is currently for 13 years old and up.
Yes. 13 years of age and up.
So when you're reading stories to your 13-year-old child.
Right. As one does.
Hi. So firstly, Rob, I've played Extra Solo and it's great. So in fact, I first saw it here at Casual Connect 4 years ago, I think it was. So there you go. Under the question, so I've done a lot of thinking about the asynchronous sort of player in VR as well, more from the side of like cooperative or competitive gaming. So you could have a VR player and then a desktop player with a keyboard and mouse. If it's a shooter, maybe there's people that are on the ground and then people that are flying around. Or maybe someone's like on a phone and they're like doing the tower defense and they're placing things, and the guy in VR, which is more agile and movement, can sort of do different things. So is there any sort of things you've thought about in like cooperative or competitive multiplayer? Asynchronously, that is?
What's the question? Should you be doing more of that stuff? Hang on, I have a slide for that.
Yes.
Yeah, experiment. Awesome. Thank you. I'd love to see your work.
Right, we'll do that. Have you guys like done anything with that, or any like prototyping or looking into anything specific?
Do you have a slide for that too?
We have some pretty goofy, we actually took one of the slides out with some of our really, really goofy sort of asymmetric games because they were terrible. Sometimes you have to go down a lot of dead ends to find good stuff. The lessons that we learned in some of that process is that asymmetric experience is great, but how do you make the players on both sides feel equally engaged in the experience? How do you balance that?
Yeah, balance is going to be very difficult.
Balance becomes really hard across devices and interfaces. Right. Already in many cases, like they don't let the console players play against the desktop players because it doesn't seem balanced. So when you're talking about completely different interfaces and viewpoints, that gets to be an even harder question.
Right. Okay, just a slightly different question as well. So Google Earth VR seems like it'd be a perfect platform for more like social experiences as well. So is anything you're doing taking in that direction?
I know we have a ton of G+ users out there, right? So honestly, it's tough. Figuring out who's going to win the social space and whether we should you log into Facebook and whether you have persistent identities. Honestly, Google hasn't delved a whole lot into that space that much.
Right. Okay, one final question, a little bit off topic, but have you thought about opening up Google Earth VR as a platform for other developers to build experiences on?
Come talk to me afterwards.
Okay, we have 1 more minute.
Oh my God, we're already almost out of time.
We're almost out of time. But give me a question. I want to hear a question.
I'll be very quick. So I had an experience recently regarding abuse where a female coworker and I were in a game for a few seconds, and people were grabbing at us like crazy. And but just as I was about to start telling them off, they started talking about what they were doing. And the short version is they didn't feel that anybody has a right to any kind of bodily integrity in a virtual space, and that it shouldn't matter unless they're abusing people in real life after practicing it in VR, basically.
Well, that's certainly an opinion.
So I was just wondering if you had any experience encountering that particular perspective and how best to speak to it and dissuading people from behaving that way.
I totally, absolutely have had that experience. It is an opinion. I think that's probably why I think that's the root of it, right? I think that's why people are abusing to begin with. The people who are engaging in those sorts of behaviors generally would not do so in real life. And again, it comes from this idea that the avatar's body is not your own body. It's not a real body. It doesn't count. It's not real. If you don't like it, why not you just get out of VR? Which I refuse to believe that VR is for the people who are harassing people, just as a standard baseline. It's really hard to combat. A lot of this has to do, honestly, I believe a lot of it has to do with the fact that VR is still so new, and that the experiences with VR are still so new, and a lot of people are equating VR as more similar to video games, and not making sort of that divide of like, no, the avatar's body is my own body. It represents where I am, and when you enact in that behavior, to my perspective, it is happening to me in my body. I have a sense of proprioception of where my body is, and it is exactly where you're grabbing, and that's heckin' gross. So I'm hoping in some ways, I'm an optimist generally, so I'm hoping that as VR becomes more prevalent and prolific, that people start understanding and have more empathy in terms of what that experience is like for others.
Awesome.
Does that help?
It does. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Time for one more?
Last one? Can we do one more?
Yeah, we
one
do.
more?
Sure. Long time between sessions.
Hello, so I'm Ken. So speaking of having your own body in VR, what do you think of motion capturing of your body in VR instead of just moving a controller and moving stuff around in VR? So do you think that there's a potential market in that, or?
Mocap.
I mean, the line between mocap, it's funny, we have like, working with academic systems in the past, oftentimes we have these like $150,000 Vicon motion capture systems, and now all of a sudden you can buy your $600 Vive and it does like almost as much. Like, sure, all you have is head and hands, but you can sort of guess the rest of your body and do a pretty good job.
Right.
What I'll definitely say about mocap is that animation system that we showed in one of the videos, the really dark video that Daniel was showing, the life that you breathe into everything that you touch through your motion feels incredible. Like it really feels like you're giving life to those spaces. And so there's I don't know quite how to answer the question, but there's definitely, I feel like we've just made mocap really easy, and it's going to be a wonderful thing, and we need more people to understand and explore the implications of where that's going to go.
Right. All right. Thank you.
As Rob touched on, I think anything you can do to make the experience feel more human. Hands and head are great, but anything you can do to start bringing in.
And hips and
helps not only with the experience, but helps with what the previous questioner asked about, which is how can we make people feel more like people, not just avatars? How can we help mitigate abuse through that?
Right. Thank you.
I want everyone to run an experiment. Like if you're experiencing a lot of abuse, deliberately recalibrate your floor so that you're 6 inches taller than everybody else and see what it changes. I don't know what it'll do, but I want people to do this and then report back to me.
Yeah. You can tweet at us. See, those are our names. Tweet at us your results. I'm really curious. And I think that's it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming.